Hi and good afternoon and welcome everyone to another installment, actually our final installment of our Whistle Stop Tour of Tanach series on Trei Asar here with the United Synagogue. Thank you everyone for joining us. And before we begin, as this is our final episode, I'd like to say a big thank you to the United Synagogue for inviting me to deliver this series. It's been an honor and I have really enjoyed it. And thank you to everyone who has joined and watched every week. So today we are going to be looking at the final prophet of Trei Asar, the 12th prophet of the 12 minor prophets, whose name is Malachi. And he is fascinating because he isn't just the last prophet of Trei Asar, he is the last prophet of all time. We've already mentioned Haggai, Zechariah, who we did the last 2 weeks, and Malachi, who we are looking at today, are the final 3 prophets of all time before prophecy was removed from the Jewish people and removed from the world. So our question today, our fundamental question is, what is the message of the last prophet of all time to us today? And Malachi, it's short, only 3 chapters, 55 verses. We read him twice throughout the year on Parshat Toldot and also on Shabbat Hagadol, which is the Shabbat just before Pesach. And again, what is his message for us today in 2020? So to answer, again, we will use our threefold approach of looking firstly at the context, when did he live? Secondly, the content, what does he actually talk about? And finally, the concepts, what is his message to his generation and to us today? As always, you can download the source sheet. It's available on a link below this video. I will share my source sheet also soon when it's relevant. Any comments, please do use the chat feature. I will check at the end of the session, at the end of the share. I'll just quickly check to see if there are any questions for me to address. And let's begin. So context, when did Malachi live? Let's look at our source sheet. As always, we begin by looking with the opening verse of the book. Normally gives us some sort of information. Unfortunately, with Malachi, we don't really have much information at all. Let's look here in source number 1, if I get my spotlight here. Masad Dvar Hashem El Yisrael B'Yad Malachi. This is the prophecy, the word of God to Israel through Malachi. We don't really get much information. There's no lineage, there's no indication of where he comes from or who his family is, and there's no time, there's no date, there's no king. So we really don't have much information about Malachi at all. And the Gemara tries to answer this. It addresses this issue of us having no information whatsoever about Malachi by trying to explain who he was. So in source number 2, let's look together at the Gemara in Masechet Megillah 15a. Here we see there are 3 opinions cited in the Gemara, 3 opinions. We're not going to read the Gemara in detail. I will read the underlined bits, which are the 3 different opinions. So let's begin with number 1. Amar Rav Nachman Malachi ze Mordechai. Rav Nachman says Malachi is Mordechai. So Mordechai from the Purim story that we know very well. Mordechai who helped to rescue the Jewish people from annihilation at the hands of Haman and Achashverosh during the Persian Empire. He's Malachi, and the Gemara explains the reason behind this is because Mordechai is called Mishneh LeMelech at the end of the Megillah, at the end of the Purim story. Mordechai is awarded with quite a high up position in the court of Achashverosh, and he's called Mishneh LeMelech, which is second to the king, which sounds like Malachi. Malachi being linked to the word king. That's one opinion, okay? Putting him at the time of the Purim story and him being Mordechai. The second opinion here, if we go down to the end of the second line where I've underlined and where I'm pointing here in the Hebrew, Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha, so a different opinion now given by Rabbi Yehoshua. Malachi is Ezra. Malachi is Ezra. Now, we've already mentioned that Ezra and the Second Temple prophets overlap a bit. Ezra is well known as being one of the Jewish leaders at the beginning of the Second Temple time. He led an Aliyah movement. He brought many Jews from Babylon, where they had been in exile, back to Israel in this time period. And the Gemara, one of the other opinions is that Malachi is Ezra. The third and final opinion here is Chachamim Amru, so not attributed to any particular rabbi, but the sages in general say, Malachi Shemo. His name is Malachi, meaning he isn't anyone else. He is his own person. We don't have to link him to another biblical personality. Malachi is Malachi. And in fact, this opinion could be taken a bit further, and we could say also that Malachi maybe isn't actually his real name. It's not mentioned anywhere else as a name. It's not used by anyone else in Tanach. So it's a unique name, and maybe it's not actually his name, rather his title, his position, meaning Malach Hashem. He was a messenger of God. We already saw Chagai was called a Malach Hashem, a messenger of God, and we've seen in Chagai and Zechariah the people were very reluctant to accept that they were prophets of God, and the text had to constantly repeat that they were a prophet from God and saying the words of God. So it could be that even more so in the time of Malachi, the people were also really reluctant, and therefore his title had to be something that represented his position and his status in order to bolster the acceptance of the people of him as a messenger of God. So possibly his name wasn't really, Malachi isn't really his name given at birth, but more comes to be his title because of his role. In essence, we don't really know which one of these three opinions is correct. I should also add that the Gemara continues, by the way. The Gemara explains why Malachi is linked to Ezra, according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha, and explains that the reason they are put together as the same person is because Ezra spoke a lot against intermarriage and marrying out of the Jewish people. It was happening a lot at this time, and Malachi also speaks against it and also urges the people to marry within the Jewish people. We will discuss that in a bit. And therefore the Gemara says that means the topic's the same, so possibly it's the same person. Essentially, we don't really know. And Radak, just to add on to that opinion here, the Radak here in source number 3, one of our medieval commentators explains that he doesn't accept this view that that Malachi is Ezra, because, and he explains here in the underlined bit, he says, Lo metzanu b'shum makom Shekar'u Navi. We haven't found anywhere that Ezra is called a prophet. Ela Ezra HaSefer. Rather, he's called Ezra the scribe, meaning a Navi puts you on a higher status than a scribe. So if he's a prophet, he would be called prophet. Ezra HaNavi, Ezra the prophet, but instead he's called Ezra HaSefer, Ezra HaScribe. The scribe, sorry. So Radak says, I don't really accept that he's Ezra because it doesn't match up. Either way, we don't know which of these three opinions is correct. We don't know much about Malachi. What we do know is that everyone agrees he was the final prophet of the Jewish people. Everyone agrees he is at the end and there are no other prophets after him. And we therefore can give him a rough date. I've put our timeline here again. It's a very similar timeline that we've used for the last 2 weeks with Haggai and Zechariah. But just to remind anyone who wasn't there for those, just to put it all into context, again, remember in 586 BCE, we have the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians and their exile. Then the Persians take over the Babylonians and become the new empire in the east, and they allow people to return to their homeland, so the Jews are now allowed to come back to Israel to begin rebuilding the temple. In 520 BCE, we saw the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah, and which we talked about for the last 2 weeks, they encouraged the people to rebuild the temple, and the temple is completed in 516. And we know from bits in Malachi, which I will show to you soon, we know that he is speaking to the people after 516, because he talks about the temple service and he talks about the second temple being completed because people are serving God there, showing that it has to come after 516 BCE. We just don't know how long after. Okay, so he's certainly after 516 BCE. So again, we don't really know much about him. Just to summarize the context, we don't know much, but we do know that he's coming after 516 BCE and that he is the final prophet of the Jewish people. So that takes us on now to the second, let's stop the share for a moment. Let's now go back to our second part of our session today, where we talk about the content. Now, it's interesting, Malachi, the book of Malachi is a bit different to the others in the sense that the whole thing is a dialogue between God through the Navi, through the prophet, and the people. And it's actually not just a dialogue. We see dialogues in other places where there's a conversation going on back and forth. That's not rare, that's not unique. What is unique is that here it's more of an argument, and it's constant throughout the whole book. Okay, the structure is constant arguments, debates, if we want a better word or a more positive word than an argument. And I think there's two important lessons we can take from that structure of Malachi. I'll show you a few examples of it in a moment. Number one, we see again that this is an example of how prophecy is disappearing from the Jewish people, and that the prophet is encouraging the people to interact directly with God, because the prophet is no longer going to be there as an intermediary. So the people need to figure out their relationship with God themselves. Okay, there's a dynamic relationship. We're allowed to argue back, right? It's dynamic. The second, which is sort of linked, but the second point I want to make based on this argumentative structure of Malachi is that, again, to learn that we're allowed to question God. It's okay. They're not rebuked for questioning God. Again, he desires that dynamic relationship with us. It's okay. What they're rebuked for is the content of their questioning, or their lack of faith, or the sins that they're doing, but they're not rebuked for the questions itself, for the fact, the act of questioning. So it shows us those two important things, a dynamic relationship, and that questioning is allowed. So what I'm going to do with you now, Malachi is split into 7 sections, and I've got a chart for you. We'll go through the chart of those 7 sections. If I share my source sheet for you again, here on page 2 of the source sheet, you'll see a chart where I'm going to fairly quickly go through the 7 sections, the topics, and use a key quotation, hopefully from each one, to explain the content there. So prophecy number 1, you'll see, by the way, a lot of them aren't linked, but we'll try and discuss at the end some sort of running theme through them. So prophecy number 1, we see is here, chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. It's about, it's really a declaration of love of God to the Jewish people, where God says, I love you. Okay, let's read the psukim actually here. So I'll begin with pasuk bet, verse 2 here. Ahavti etchem amar Hashem. I have loved you, says God. Okay, that's the beginning of the dialogue. God says, I love you to the Jewish people. Va'amartem b'ma ahavtanu, but you say to me, but the Jewish people say to God, how have you loved us? We don't feel loved. Where have you shown us your love? Says the Jewish people. That's an example of the argument. They're arguing back. They're saying, you don't love us. You haven't shown us your love. Halo ach Esav leYaakov na'um Hashem. Isn't Yaakov and Esav brothers, says God? Va'ohev et Yaakov. But I have loved Yaakov, Jacob. Ve'esav sadeti, and Esav I have hated. Okay, or rejected, as is translated here. This is really interesting. God is proving and declaring his love for the Jewish people by contrasting it to his hatred of one of our enemies, the people of Edom, who descended from Esau. And it's really interesting. Why is this a way of declaring love? It's a bit strange. And we've talked at length a few weeks ago when we did Avadia. We talked a lot in detail about the Jewish people's relationship with Edom and the descendants of Esau, and what that means to us today. And we saw that essentially Edom seems to have taken on, has become a symbol for all of our enemies and all that is evil. And really why? You know, we debated a bit why then. And it's interesting that it appears, though, again now in the Second Temple period. So it's important to understand there's a history between the Jewish people and the people of Edom. But that gets worse in this time period? Because, well, we already said that during the destruction of the first temple, the Edomites urged the Babylonians on and said, destroy it, destroy it. They encouraged them. But even more after this time period, when the Jewish people started to return to the land of Israel after the Babylonian exile at the beginning of the Second Temple period, they saw that Edomites had settled in areas of Israel, and they were very, very upset. But there were also other nations who had settled in areas of the land of Israel during this time period. Why was Edom such an issue? Well, the issue is as discussed here. Halo ach Esav leYaakov. Esav and Yaakov were brothers. If we go back to the story of Yaakov and Esav, the two twin sons of Yitzchak and Rivka in Bereshit in the book of Genesis, we saw there that Yaakov was chosen to be the father of the Jewish people instead of Esav. And the people now, in the time of Malachi, in the Second Temple period, remember, they feel rejected, they feel cast off from God, they feel this despair and abandonment after the Chorban, the destruction of the first temple. And when they see the Edomites settling in the land of Israel, they think maybe God's cast us off and chosen Esav instead, and chosen the brother of Yaakov instead. That's what they're worried about. Okay, that they are no longer the chosen people, and instead the new chosen people is the people of Edom, the descendants of Esau. So the Navi is telling them categorically, I have chosen Yaakov, that Esau seneti, and I have hated or rejected, as it's translated here, I've rejected Esau. He's reassuring the people, you are still the chosen people, I still love you. And continues to say, don't worry, even if you see them settling, I will destroy that. It's not forever, it's not permanent. You are still the people I love. I have not chosen an alternative. Okay, so this follows on the similar theme that we saw in Haggai and Zechariah of an encouragement to the Jewish people, a reassurance that God still is there for them. That's prophecy number one, encouragement. Prophecy number two here is a prophecy to the Kohanim, more of a rebuke to them, that the people are bringing bad sacrifices to the temple. Okay, if we look here where I've bolded it in Pasuk Zion, Magishim al Mizbachi lechem mug'al. They are offering on my altar bad or defiled food. By the way, this is the proof that this is after 516 BCE, because they're in the Second Temple, they're bringing the temple service, they're serving God in the temple without even it being a big deal. It's the norm now. They are back in the Second Temple. And Malachi here is rebuking the Kohanim, the priests, for not educating the people properly about the temple service. What's really interesting here is that even though the temple has now been rebuilt, remember Haggai and Zechariah were all about encouraging the people to rebuild the temple because that would have really helped us. But it hasn't helped. The relationship with God is still lacking. People are still not serving God the way they're meant to, even now that there's a second temple, even now that there are the priests bringing the temple service and so on. Korbanot and the temple is not the focus of Malachi, but it's used here as an example of the damaged relationship between God and the Jewish people. So we see here, prophecy 2 is this rebuke that we're not serving God the way we're meant to. Prophecy number 3 here is on a totally different topic again. And it's in essence a rebuke to the Jewish people that they are marrying out of their religion. And it's a call to the Jewish people to stick together and to marry other Jewish people. Now, this we have to remember to understand within the context of the time period. The Jewish people at the time were downtrodden, they were poor, they were weak, they were at the mercy of the rulers of the Persian Empire. They had many enemies living around them who were more powerful and stronger than them, causing them problems. And they were really, really small. They were dwindling, and they were worried that if people continued to marry out as they were doing, especially in Babylon, in Bavel, in the exile, many Jews assimilated, and they were worried that if people kept marrying out of the Jewish people, the people would just get smaller and smaller until they would be hardly any left. And it was very much an important call from the people. They felt that the existence of the Jewish people was in threat, and therefore the leaders had to make it very clear to the people that they needed to try and marry within the people. And the language here is quite strong. If I just read verse 11 in the English, it says that Yehuda, meaning the Jewish people, has broken faith, abhorrent things have been done. Yehuda has profaned what is holy, meaning that marrying outside of Jewish people really was taken seriously. Now, again, I should point out here that the Navi and the leaders don't necessarily have a problem with people converting and joining the Jewish people and marrying, people who it would be okay to marry someone who's choosing to serve God and keep the Torah. The worry here is the alien gods. The worry is marrying outside into other religions and then you stop serving God. That's really the worry here. And it talks here about it being also against Eshet Nurecha, it being a betrayal of the wife of your youth, meaning that when the men are marrying outside of the religion, the daughters of the generation, maybe people they even had agreed to marry, or maybe people they already married, it's unfair on them because maybe now they're taking a new wife or a second wife or divorcing the Jewish wife in order to marry outside of the religion, and then the women have no one, they're left with no one to marry. So it's described in quite a lot of detail, the ramifications of it, and essentially it's really part of a much wider discussion about intermarriage, but here it's very strong and clear that the Navi is trying to encourage people to keep the Jewish people strong by marrying within the community where they can. Let's move on to prophecy number 4. We see here that this is a discussion of really the day of judgment, the future day of judgment. And this is quite interesting. We see here that God is telling the people off for their questions of God's justice. So if I just read here in the Hebrew where I've highlighted it here, it says, "Ba'amarchem kol oseh ra tov b'nei Hashem, u'behem hu chafetz." Because you have said, so this is God now saying, the Jewish people have said that wicked people are good in the eyes of God and he desires the wicked people. I mean, that's a bit of a strange thing to be saying. Or maybe instead they're saying, Elokei HaMishpat, where is the God of justice? So clearly this links back to that question that we talked about a few weeks ago at length with Habakkuk, Sadik v'rala, Rasha v'tovlo. Why do the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper? And the people are saying, God, where's your justice? Why aren't the wicked people being punished? And the Navi says to them very clearly, the day of judgment is going to come. But just remember that while you're asking for strict judgment for those other people, for those enemies of yours, remember that strict judgment will come upon you too. And remember, are you righteous? Have you done everything proper? Because maybe judgment will come to you and punishment will come to you too. I think this is a really strong message for us today, to focus only inwards and not outwards. Don't always point the finger at the other. Think of yourself. Are you doing everything that you possibly can at this moment to be a good person and to do the right thing? Don't only always say, oh, it's their fault, they're blame, they need to get punished. Why don't we just think about ourselves? If everyone focused on themselves, the world would be a far better place. So now let's move on to number 5. This is a rebuke of the people that they're not giving Ma'aseh and Truma, the tithes properly. Again, clear to us that we're not serving God the way we're meant to, even at the time of the Second Temple, even at the time of the temple service being there. There's more to say here, but I don't have so much time, so I'll just move on. But essentially, it's a rebuke to the people that they're not keeping the mitzvot, the commandments properly. And then number 6 here, we see... interesting, this links very much to number 4. It's again another question about why do the righteous suffer. But here it's coming from a different point of view. As I've written, it's about the God-fearers, a future reward for the God-fearers. Why? Because the God-fearers here are questioning what's the purpose to it all. Here it's a question coming from the people who are serving God, saying, what's the purpose? We're trying our hardest, we're doing the commandments, we're keeping the Torah, and we're serving God, but we don't get anything for it. What's the point? It's as if they're considering giving up. And a word of encouragement comes to them here from the Navi, from Malachi, where he says, don't worry, it's all being written down, B'Sefer Zikaron, in a scroll of remembrance. And in the future, the day will come where you will get your reward for it. Nothing is going unnoticed, and it's all being written down, it's all being recorded. And I think this is quite apt for us now in El as we come up to Rosh Hashanah in a couple of weeks, where we talk about the book of remembrance, the book of life and death being opened before God, and we all get inscribed. This is potentially the source of that idea in the Tanach of there being a book of remembrance, that everything is written down. So you see very nicely how everything links together. Then we see the seventh part of Malachi is the closing, the last few verses, which we're going to talk about in a moment in the concept section. What we can see here is that essentially the content of Malachi is divided into two. We have either, on the one hand, encouragement to the people, God still loves you, and so on. And on the other hand, we have rebuke, that you still need to keep the mitzvah properly. Okay, so there's a mix of rebuke and encouragement here. Let's now try and bring this all together and try and think really what are the key concepts of Malachi for us and how are they relevant today in 2020. So I want to share with you three main ideas, three main concepts here. Number one is a call for social justice. Number two is about encouragement that this connection to God is still there. We've touched a bit upon these, but I'll just go through it again. And finally, the main concept is this final message of a hope for a better future. So let's just go through these. Number one, social justice. It's interesting to note that the prophet does rebuke the people for, again, their lack of social justice. I mean, so many of the prophets of Trei Asar have discussed this lack of social justice, and we see it here in Malachi just the same. Malachi here in source number 4 in chapter 3, verse 5, says, I'm going to deal with you, meaning I'm going to have to deal with those of you who are misbehaving. What are they misbehaving in? Let's look. We'll just read the English for time purposes. Here I have highlighted it in the grey. Who practice sorcery, which is witchcraft. And it's really interesting that the witchcraft comes up here, but that's a topic for another time. So witchcraft, who commit adultery, who swear falsely, who cheat labourers of their hire, and who subvert the cause of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. Meaning, clear rebuke to the people for not doing these things. They're not keeping social justice. And I think that we can see that prophet after prophet has come and told the people that they need to treat their fellow man better. And they're just not doing it. And I think this message applies to us in every generation today, even more so. We need to remember that these mitzvah of how we treat each other are so fundamental. Just to be kind, just to look after people. Again, often it's we think, oh, it's down to the other person, he'll do it. But everyone needs to ask themselves, are they doing everything that they possibly can to ensure that we live in a better society? That is number one, the concept, the call for social justice. Number two is an encouragement that our relationship with God is still there. We've seen this with Haggai, we've seen it with with Zechariah, and Malachi is no different. For example, look in verse number 6, where I've bolded it for you. For I am the Lord, I have not changed, and you are the children of Jacob, you have not ceased to be. Meaning, nothing is different. God is telling us, no matter how despaired we are, because the situation is so bad right now, we think that God has abandoned us, but God is telling us, no, I'm still here, we are still connected, our relationship is still the same. And here, it continues in verse 7 with again another very beautiful idea, Shuvu alai v'ashuva aleichem, where I've underlined it. Turn back to me and I will turn back to you. Meaning, you have to want the relationship. It's not a free ticket. You have to also work for it. But if you take one step towards me, I'll take a step towards you and I'll meet you in the middle. We've seen this a couple of times in our series. And again, really nice idea for us in Elul to think about teshuvah. God is going to help us to do it. He desires our teshuvah. He desires our connection with him. And that potential is still there. Okay, so those are, again, those two ideas, call for social justice and the connection with God is still there. The final thing that I want to talk to you about is this message for the future. So essentially, what I really want to make it really clear to you again. We're not just finishing our series on Trei Asar today with Malachi. Malachi is essentially seen as the conclusion of the entire section of Nevi'im within the Tanach, of the whole section of the prophets. If you remember the structure of Tanach that I showed you in our introductory session all those weeks ago, Trei Asar, the 12 minor prophets, comes at the end of the middle section of the Tanach, which is the section of the Nevi'im, the prophets. Therefore, Malachi is the final book of the Nevi'im, of the prophets, the final prophet of all time, as we've already said. And his message to the people in 516 BCE is the final prophetic message to all the future generations. No other prophet came after him to give us a new message. Therefore, we really need to try and understand his final parting message and how we can learn from it today. So the final 3 verses of Malachi become incredibly important to us because they are the final verses of prophecy of all time. So again, let's come back to our source sheet. I'll share it with you again to look at this. Okay, so Malachi, source number 5, we're in. These are the final 3 verses of Malachi, chapter 3, verses 22. Zichru Torat Moshe. Avdi asher tziviti oto b'chorev al kol Yisrael. Remember the Torah of Moshe, my servant, that I commanded you on Chorev, meaning Har Sinai, to all of Israel, chukim u'mishpatim, the laws and the judgments. So number 1, the message, remember the Torah, meaning keep the Torah. Message number 2 here, Hine anochi sholech lechem et Eliyahu hanavi. Behold, I am sending to you Elijah the prophet, meaning the Mashiach. I am going to send the Messiah to you. Lifnei bo yom Hashem hagadol v'hanora. Before the coming of the great and awesome day of judgment. Meaning, I will send the Mashiach to you before the final judgment. Let's continue here. Chaf Daled, v'heshiv leiv avot al banim v'leiv banim al avotam, and I will return the hearts of fathers to their sons and the hearts of sons to their fathers. Pen avot v'heketi et kol haaretz cherem, lest I come and destroy the entire world. So it's a bit interesting what this final bit means. It seems like the Mashiach is going to come and restore our relationships, restore friendships and family, the family structure, so that we're not all destroyed. Rav Professor Eliasis explains that actually it's a metaphor for our relationship with God. God's called our Father. We say Avinu Malkeinu on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. He is our Father and we are his children, meaning the Mashiach, therefore, is going to come and restore our relationship with God before the final judgment so that we will have some merit, we will be rewarded rather than punished in the final day of judgment. And I think why is this so significant? What's really significant here is, again, it's a reminder to keep the Torah, but then it's also a message of hope. The Mashiach will come, the redemption will come. Tomorrow will be better. This is the secret of Jewish survival. No matter how bad it is today, we believe tomorrow could be better. The Mashiach could come any day. The redemption could come any day. So there's always this belief tomorrow will be better. And that gets us through those dark days, those difficult times, the hope that the future will be better. And I want to just add something else onto this, that the Rashi, the great medieval French commentator, explains on this about this idea of returning the hearts to fathers and sons and so on. Here in source number 6, he says that the Mashiach, Eliyahu, is going to come to make peace in the world. It's where I've underlined at the end of source number 6. Eliyahu will come and make peace, meaning not just peace between people, but also peace between us and God, meaning all our questions will be answered. Those people earlier in Malachi who questioned the justice of God and said, why do the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer? Those answers will all be clear. Okay, he'll make peace, meaning we'll understand why everything had to happen the way it had to happen. Okay, and it will all be clear to us. So the final message is one of encouragement. It's one of hope. Not just to the generation at the start of the Second Temple period, the generation of Malachi, sometime after 516 BCE, but also to us today in 2020. We are faced with many problems today. And despite not having a temple or the prophets to act as an intermediary between us and God, we know we are encouraged by Malachi to know that God still loves us. He still watches over us. He still desires a relationship with us. And that the promise of a redemption, the promise of a better future still stands. There is hope that tomorrow will be better. But there is one caveat. Malachi does remind us, Zichru Torat Moshe. Remember the Torah. We have to keep our side of the bargain. It's not a free ticket. We still need to strive to keep the Torah and to establish social justice. In order to benefit from this future generation, we have to do our bit. So just to summarize and bring it all together, with our chart here on the source sheet, Malachi lived at the early Second Temple period, sometime just after the completion of the Second Temple in 516 in Jerusalem. He covers a range of topics, including a rebuke for their sins and a call for social justice, but also, very importantly, there's strong encouragement there that God still loves the Jewish people. And the concept, we said, is a call for social justice, so strong today. We need to be kind. We need to see as individuals what can we do to make our society, our community, a better place to be. Secondly, an encouragement that the connection with God still exists. God desires it. We just need to make the first step towards him, and he'll help us along the way. And finally, a hope for a future redemption, that tomorrow will be better. The ending message is the promise that the Mashiach, the Eliyahu, will come and he'll make things, the world, into a better place. I would just like to finish by saying a massive thank you to the United Synagogue for inviting me to teach this series on Trei Asar. As I said, it's been a great honor and a privilege. I also want to thank those of you who have watched my shiurim week after week, those of you who have sent me feedback and questions via email along the way. It's been great interacting with you. Please do stay in touch. Please do email me with any questions or feedback, learnwithpnina@gmail.com. And I hope very much that we can learn together in the future, hopefully in person someday soon. I hope that you've enjoyed this whistle-stop tour of Trei Asar. I hope that you can take the meaning from these ancient prophets into our modern lives, because their message is so relevant for us today. Again, that really, if you take nothing else from this series, the really important thing is that every single thing inside the Tanach is relevant for us today in 2020. We just have to look at it with the right lens to try and understand the message. Sometimes it's easier than others. So I really hope you've been able to take something out of this course, as a message into our lives today. Essentially, I wish you all Shana Tova, a happy, a healthy, a sweet new year ahead. And once again, thank you to everyone for joining. I will quickly just check now to see if there are any questions or comments for me to answer on the stream. Let me see. Okay, no comments so far. Again, then I will leave it there. Thank you so much. Please be in touch, and Shana Tova. Bye.